Thank you. These two seem fairly close together. Let me start with this one though. What degree of Islamophobia is seen within the school system? And I think this could maybe be interpreted a little more broadly or more specifically, depending on what people would like to address it. And also the degree that there might be, in fact, discrimination in terms of housing locally, for example, in Montgomery County or Maryland. And then also that leads to the sort of related, perhaps, issues with hiring. Again, looking at Islamophobia. The other two that are fairly similar, and these are the last two that I have up here, I'm choosing them for the end because it really is asking sort of next steps, what could people do? The other one says, what were key factors that sort of propelled and initiated Islamophobia? And sort of what would you suggest? This is specifically about those who may become elected officials a little bit down the line, maybe in the next election cycle or the one after that. Sort of how would we approach them? How would we educate them, perhaps?
I'll take on the like kind of roots of Islamophobia, and there's a lot of literature, or more literature. So like, I know we spent a lot of time talking about 9/11, but it's not something that started with 9/11. I think if you look at the ideas of like Orientalism and Islamophobia, and thinking of those, how they're linked as well, and thinking if we think about the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the U.S. kind of reaction of that, and I think that is a way to think about like where potentially we can think about like Islamophobia as like a way to project our power abroad, start being part of the conversation. But also thinking about in terms of, like I mentioned, the majority of Muslims in this country are black, and how that also interplays in terms of anti-black racism in this country. And we think about people like Malcolm X, who, him and MLK were obviously, very much maligned, but there was always something specific, more vitriolic in the way Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam were treated versus, what was seen as more of, the mainstream civil rights movement, etc. And thinking about how that also plays a role in terms of Islamophobia and the relationship moving forward. And then there's also people making money off of Islamophobia. Not just the CVE, but there's a whole Islamophobia network. And if you guys Google Islamophobia network, you'll see. And this is very much closely tied to issues around activism for Palestine as well, where you'll have groups, right-wing pro-Israel groups, who fund, someone like Sheldon Adelson, for example, who funds things like, illegal settlements built on stolen Palestinian lands, and will also pour in money to support Islamophobic groups. It's not coincidence that people like Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, who are Frank Gaffney, who are extremely anti-Muslim, are also extremely pro-Israel. It's not coincidence at all, because part of the idea again of like justifying the assault on Palestinians, on Arabs and Muslims is that we need to continue to push forward the idea that Muslims are terrorists and they need to just be destroyed, and how that helps obviously not only the United States, but a lot of US allies such as Israel. So I think that broadening, your concept of what Islamophobia is beyond just what, the current relationship of the US and the war on terror and how others are, and then historically, how does it relate to the US relationship to the region, but then how the United States also has treated other marginalized communities within the United States and used Islamophobia to shut down activism.
So in terms of educating elected officials, I'm a bit cynical about this, but let's take it at face value for a minute. I think that what groups like Montgomery County are trying to do is very much that, right? To educate political officials about the ramifications of the policies they're in support of. And I think that that's something a lot of groups do, whether it's the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, whether it's Defending Rights and Dissent Foundation. This is what they're trying to do, right? If you're not aware of perhaps the implications, the consequences, and who precisely is the target of these policies that you're supporting, then it's imperative for you to know. So I think that there are a lot of groups doing that. Now, what I think is often something we assume that is incorrect is that it's miseducation that is at the root of their support for these policies, right? So when we enter into situations, we often think of Islamophobia as sort of, again, like if you just knew Muslims, you wouldn't hate them, right? But there's also the strand of people who hate Muslims because they know about Islam and Muslims. They're very racist, xenophobic, and it's not about them knowing more about the religion and faith. It's about directly confronting their racist, xenophobic sentiments. So I think, in general, we have to have a nuanced approach to what exactly are we working with. Is it out of ignorance that the person is supporting certain policies, or is it out of something else? Is it out of their desire to help perpetuate the imperialist U.S. government? Now, I think another point that bears mentioning is the fact that when we talk about, for example, the immigration discourse and debate in American society, when we are thinking about the immigration ban, often the response is, this is not who we are as Americans. Well, it is very much who we are as America. This is what America has done to systematically deny various groups of people immigration status or refugee status. It's something that the U.S. has done in El Salvador to create civil war, but then deny people entry to this country. So when we're thinking about how to frame the discourse in terms of what are we couching immigration ban in what terms, we need to think about what the actual history of this country is. So I think that that is also a place where perhaps political officials can become educated. Now, given that the U.S. government is primarily an establishment of white males, it probably won't work that well, but that is to say that it is important for us as Americans and as policymakers to really understand the history of this country, because the narrative goes very far in sustaining and justifying certain policies, and in the absence of that, we're not going to get that far.
Radicals. I think that Ramah covered how Islamophobia goes far back. I remember organizing in Chicago during the first Iraq War, and the FBI was paying visits on Arab Americans in Chicago's Arab American community. And then as far as local Islamophobia, I don't know about housing and schools. I definitely know that our police are racial profiling people, and Muslims tending to be black or brown do tend to get pulled over more often. Where we don't have statistics on that, that's just anecdotal, but kind of fits. For future elected officials, I would say a couple of things. I think Ramah covered foreign policy, which I think is crucial. Another thing that's a little uncomfortable for us in our liberal enclave is, you might remember the no-fly, no-buy bill. After, I can't remember when it was introduced, but it was to prohibit people on the no-fly list from being able to buy guns. And seemed to be a nice gun control measure until you realize there's no due process for people whose names are listed on that no-fly list, and they tend to be, guess what, Muslim. I actually don't have an update on that bill, but I know that, let's just say that you need to look deeper at things and understand who they're going to impact. And again, I would mention surveillance. Mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. And then another thing that I wanted to mention is the idea of expanding the notion of sanctuary to Muslims, which is a term I first heard from my wonderful Maha. And I think that in our area and in Montgomery County, there is this desire to be as safe a place as we can for immigrants, including Muslims and native-born Muslims, for lack of a better word. And if we follow the example of the kind of the trust or sanctuary model of not just willy-nilly giving information to the federal government. There's a lot of ways that our local police could be less cooperative, particularly with the FBI and with the Department of Homeland Security's fusion centers, and be feeding them less information on, quote, suspicious activity that is still legal activity, but that tends to spread, suspicion on Muslims and get more Muslims than need to be entered into federal databases. So I think that's something that we should be exploring locally, and that our local politicians should also be aware of.